Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and a warm welcome to Invest Africa. I'm Nozi Pombanjwa. Now on tonight's show, we tackle the sometimes contentious issue of Chinese investment into Africa. Is it a mutually beneficial relationship, or does one party get more out of this deal than the other? But before we answer that question, let's take a quick look at the China-Africa investment relationship. What we have here is a snapshot. We've got a window that gives us a sense of the relationship between 2009 to 2011. And what we see is that officially in 2009, China surpassed the US as Africa's largest trading partner. We saw total trade between China and Africa growing from $6.3 billion to $166 billion in 2011, and that's just between 2009 and 2011 in that 2-year window. What we also know is that China is increasingly relying on Africa for its oil imports, and we see that number there, that China gets a third of its oil imports out of Africa. If we take a closer look at the relationship and we see the asymmetry of this relationship, we note that Africa only constitutes about 4% of China's total global trade. However, China accounts for 13% of Africa's global trade. We also know in terms of the commodities front that 90% of China's cobalt comes from Africa, and 35% of China's manganese comes from Africa, and 30% of China's titanium comes from Africa. So a heavy reliance on the commodities front for China from Africa. If we take a look at the investment landscape a little bit closely, we also see that in that 2-year window between 2009 and 2011, investment increased by 60%. That's Chinese investment into Africa. And we also take a look at the foreign direct investment coming from China into Africa. And by 2011, that number was sitting at $14.7 billion. It's 2015 now, and no doubt that number has certainly grown. We know that there are more than 2,000 Chinese companies that are invested in Africa. If we take a look at the movement of senior personnel between China and Africa, we know that in the last 50 years, more than 160 Chinese dignitaries, and here we're talking about individuals at a ministerial level or higher, have visited Africa, and they've done more than 667 visits thus far. And if we take a look at the human personnel part of this conversation, we know that more than 1 million Chinese nationals work and live in Africa. So that's just a broad outline of the Chinese-Africa relationship between 2009 and 2011. And 3 years on, no doubt, or 4 years on rather, these numbers have surely grown. But what we're going to do now is I'm going to allow my studio guests to participate in this conversation and to share their insights. In Cape Town, we're joined by Glenn Ho. He's a partner at KPMG. And in Nairobi, we're joined by Kenneth Okwaro. He's a director at the Africa Center for People, Institutions and Society. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Let me start off in Cape Town. And Glenn, maybe bring us to the fore. Why is China's attraction to Africa and investment into Africa considered to be such a contentious issue?
Nasipa, I think there have been certain instances where there's been bad practice by certain Chinese companies in Africa, and those have grabbed the headlines. And I think also Africa also feels we are always exporting a lot of commodities and then re-importing those commodities as finished product from China. So I think that creates some of the issues, and I think as we've seen recently as well, where there's a lot of unemployment, so in many countries Chinese traders and business people get a bad rap because they feel that perhaps they're taking jobs that should be jobs here in Africa for Africans.
And before I go to Kenya, let me just quickly follow up with you, Glenn. You raised some of these contentious issues. Are they a reflection of the reality on the ground?
I think it probably, there is some reality in it, but I think if you look at the bigger picture, it's probably balanced in with some good investment, some job creation, and some value add that we've even seen here in Cape Town with the Hisense factory, where we see job creation happening and manufacturing being moved to Africa.
Kenneth, let's come to you in Nairobi and let's bring in the East African experience of Chinese trade relations into this conversation. On the back, of course, we know that there's a huge infrastructure investments from the Chinese part into Kenya and the region broadly. Give us a sense of how you would describe Chinese relations with Kenya.
Well, right now, the relationship between China and Kenya, in the eyes of the public in Kenya, is one that is sort of controversial, like you have said. And it is because of a lot of misinformation, if you ask me. And that misinformation is not helped by the Chinese, not allowing that information to flow so that people can know the true character of development cooperation between China and Kenya. That is, whether it is in terms of debt, or it is in terms of ODA, or it is in terms of investment or trade. So Kenyans or East Africans look at China as an emerging, partner with our governments in terms of, putting together huge infrastructure projects that we see going on, the Standard Gauge Railway, and a lot of many other projects. So if you ask me right now, people are seeing China coming to work more with our governments, but the true character or the true nature of the relationship is not clear. So that a lot says or answers the question why it is controversial. And
Kenneth, and let me follow up with what might seem to be a simplistic question, but I think will help us get to the nuts and bolts of this conversation. What does China want out of Africa?
I think China wants to continue to increase its volume of trade with Africa, which of course, like you said at the beginning, is actually increasing. It has surpassed the United States of America. I think also China is looking to increase its investments in Africa in terms of in agriculture, in extraction of natural resources, in manufacturing. But I also think China is looking to play the international politics or international political economy stuff, whereas it's trying to be a more prominent player in terms of the politics and economics of the African region.
And Glenda, let's come back and perhaps continue on the political economy angle that Kenneth has just brought into the conversation. And let's bring China into the BRICS membership with South Africa, and understanding that South Africa says that it's representing the rest of the continent. What are African countries getting out of China?
I think a bit of everything. We're seeing the investment in infrastructure, which I think is positive. Kenneth mentioned the East African Railway project. I think that's very good for intra-African trade. And I think there's also some technologies that they are bringing to Africa, as well as certain products that I think are adequately priced for developing economies like China itself. So you're seeing smartphones being rolled out on the continent at a price that Africans want to buy and can afford.
And of course, I want to continue on that note and bring you back, Kenneth. There have been views that the Chinese have been able to surpass the US and even the European Union because of the agility on the ground, the practical nature with which they're able to navigate the African context. How does China do business in Africa? How would we describe that relationship?
Well, I think it begins from at the top. You see, like you mentioned, a lot of Chinese emissaries have come from China to Africa and talked with African governments, and they have laid the groundwork in terms of treaties and bilateral agreements, and concessions. So those lay down the framework within which now Chinese firms or Chinese businesses then get into work in Africa. So one, that helps to put together the framework when somebody comes to work to set up a business, for example in Kenya or in Uganda or somewhere in Southern Africa. Once they have had an agreement with the government, it's easier to penetrate, it's easier to do the processing work to set up a business. So I think the fact that China, first of all, makes sure that the relationship with the government is good, or so to speak, is symbiotic like they want it to be, then it makes doing business easier. I think that is the first thing I would say about how the Chinese do business with Africans.
Glenn, would you
The second thing,
Kenneth, let me jump in and let me just pull in Glenn and I'll come back. I want to get into this point of easing business or doing business between China and Africa. Glenn, we've just recently heard in recent weeks that South Africa has cancelled its South African Airways route to Beijing. But we also know that there are various councils under the BRICS membership that are working to improve the ease of doing business between all the member countries. Is this improving? Are we seeing more business between China and Africa precisely because there's been an effort of making doing business that much easier?
I think so, Nasipa, and I think maybe the other side of the coin is also making it easier for African businesses to do business in China. I think from the African side there definitely has been initiatives to try and make that easier, and I think talking about that Beijing route, I think we couldn't continue funding it at that sort of price. And there's talk about Air China coming in now as well, which should help to restore that air bridge between the two countries, in addition to the other routes that can be used.
Glenn, you have the advantage of having a bird's eye view both over the South African business environment as well as the Chinese business environment. The South African and African businesses broadly that have made the leap and penetrated the Chinese market, how would we describe the experience of doing business in China? Is it as easy as we'd like to believe?
Actually, I was having dinner with someone last night from a South African company that's starting to see the dividends of their investment in China. It's taken probably at least 4 years, but now they see it taking off at quite a pace. And when you've got a population of 1.2 billion, and if you enter that market, you just need a small portion of it to actually see a huge return on investment. But I think many people have burnt their fingers, and many will continue to. And there is an investment price to pay, but I think it's a long haul if you're going into China.
On that note, let's take a short break. We've just scratched the surface in terms of the business and the trade relations between China and African businesses. When we come back, we'll dig a little bit deeper into these issues and much, much more. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Tonight we're delving into the China-Africa relationship. Remember that you can be a part of these conversations. That's by tweeting us during the show at CNBC Africa or follow me at The Real Nozi. And don't forget that the hashtag is Invest Africa. Still with me, I have my guest. Glenn Ho is a partner at KPMG and he joins us from Cape Town. And Kenneth Okwaro is a director at the Africa Center for People, Institutions and Society, and he joins us from our Nairobi studio. I want to start the conversation in Nairobi with you, Kenneth, and let's talk about the basket of trade that we are seeing between China and Africa. In the first segment, we spoke a lot about the commodity-heavy basket. Is this changing? Are we seeing other products and services beginning to emerge between these two trade players?
Well, I sort of do not think it has changed markedly, because most of the commodities that still come from China into Kenya or into Africa, if I may say, still is products which are made from the light industries like textiles and apparels. And I think much as trade has increased, I think the amount of the items that the two countries are still, or the two regions, the Africa and China, are still trading, has not changed markedly.
Glenn, so what Kenneth is telling us is that we're seeing an increase in volume, but there's no change in value. I'd like your comment on that, but also perhaps if you can also give us a sense of in where do we see the potential for change? If we are to have a value addition and new products and services emerging, where do you see that potential to come from?
I think there's been a slight change in the sense that with the export of agro-processed products, more wine exports to China, canned fruit as well. But I think on the areas that where there's potential, it's probably the areas that are laid out in China's 5-year plans. And the areas in the 5-year plans that I think we can add value are in the service sector, areas like healthcare and health-related areas, which I think there is a need for. So I think when we see the new 5-year plan in 2016 coming out from China, we'll see a lot more of those areas where there's high-end technology and engineering that they're looking at as well. I think we've got quite a bit of that in Africa, and some of those technologies we can export to them going forward.
So Glenn, just to stay with you on this point, all eyes on 2016 to get that 5-year plan, but maybe give us a sense of the policy environment. Has the policy environment been enabling and encouraging of African businesses to penetrate the market?
I think there has been, and I think there's the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation meeting being held in South Africa this year, and I think in that forum, African countries also have the opportunity to actually push for more of that opening up of that market for Africa.
Let's move over back to Nairobi, and Kenneth, I want to introduce a slightly different angle to the conversation, and I would like for us to talk about the rising labor or wages in China and how that's putting pressure on the Chinese strategy into Africa. What has been your observation in terms of the kind of wages that Chinese companies would pay for their African workers, given the fact that it's just become increasingly uncompetitive for them to produce and manufacture in China?
Well, I think the wage issue is still a very important issue that has not been clarified by most of the investors or most of the people who trade with Africa, whether it's China or whether other countries. In many African countries, the wages that are paid are very low, and that actually has been what has been attracting many investors into most of the investment markets in Africa. So I think if Chinese businesses are growing in their investments in Africa, they should work towards improving their wages for whoever it is they're employing in Africa. But I think the conversation about that minimum or the level of wage shouldn't be had to the point where it jeopardizes the interest of Chinese businesses into working with African governments. However, I also think that we also see a lot of Chinese businesses bringing in their own staff or their own people from China into Africa. And therefore, it also still, much as we want to increase the wages, it also eats eats into the market for employees or people, or the labor market in African countries.
That's a very interesting observation, and I want to throw that to Glenn. And Glenn, for you to give us the South African perspective here on the wage environment amongst Chinese or Asian firms in South Africa, but also the phenomenon of Chinese companies bringing their own workers into South Africa, especially given the volatility that we've seen in the South African environment when it comes to foreign nationals. What does that picture look like?
I think there's still quite a few people being brought in from China. Some obviously have the skills that we may not have currently, but I think there should be a stronger push from our side that the transfer of skills must happen and happen in a more definite period, so that if there is skills being brought in from China, that they are being transferred to local Africans so that we can actually build the economy going forward. I think that is going to be important for China as well, for a sustainable investment environment in Africa.
Let's move on from the labor conversation, and let's talk about the consumers for a moment. Kenneth, let me bring you into the conversation once again. There's always been a overriding sentiment or perception that the Made in China brand is the same or equated to inferior quality and is not as durable as other markets that might produce or manufacture a similar product. Has this changed from the African perspective, or are the Chinese still fighting to put their brand on a qualitative perception for Africans?
Well, the issue of quality of Chinese products still remains. If you look at phones, for example, you look at the quality of phones from China and the ones from America or South Korea, you still find that the quality of Chinese products is not up to that standard. However, I want to say that much as some of the Chinese products are not to the quality or the standards that people might require, the substandard or lower or cheaper products, for example, in the phones category of products, has made it easier or has made it possible for a category of consumers in Africa who are very low income to access some of those goods, so that you can find somebody in a very rural area in Africa with the phone, and those phones are, you find most of them are made in China. So there is that discussion about the quality of those products, but there's also the discussion about affordability, which probably the Chinese products are providing affordable goods, but not as per standard that we're looking for.
Glenn, can we make an assumption then from Kenneth's insight that when it comes to the bottom of the pyramid, that Chinese companies have all but captured that market when we compare them to other external trading partners, because they seem to understand what the bottom of the pyramid needs and can afford?
I think so, Nosipa, and I think because it's such a big manufacturing environment, some of those better name brand products might not be Chinese, but a lot of the components are made in China, but definitely the low-end ones will be from China. But I think as the marketing base shifts out of China to the rest of Asia, you might see more and more brands coming in from outside China as well, as the wages increase within China.
We've got about 4 minutes left for the show, so I quickly want to shift focus just to talk about infrastructure investment. And maybe let me bring you in first. There's a perception again that resides when it comes to the Chinese investing in Africa, that a lot of it is based on debt. Do we have an understanding what this new and evolving China-Africa relationship actually means for the amount of debt that is owed to China by Africa?
We have had this discussion before about the increasing amount of debt or creditors coming from China into Africa, and which is actually helping to bridge a gap, a resource gap for many African governments in terms of what they need for funding most of their development projects, like in infrastructure, if I can say.
Glenn, let me bring you into this conversation. Let's talk about the cost of capital. Is capital coming from China necessarily cheaper than capital that would come from other markets where we could be borrowing from?
Probably from the sense that sometimes China will loan money where some of the other sources won't loan the money. So perhaps that, from that point of view, the cost of capital is cheap, and I think we're probably going to see more infrastructure development going forward as well with the One Belt, One Road initiative from China, which I think is quite an integrated approach from China, linking it up via the Middle East, via Africa to Europe. And I think along that way, you'll probably see more infrastructure happening. And we just saw the deal with Pakistan recently as well for infrastructure development.
All very encouraging signs. And in particular, if we look at the collaboration between the Chinese Central Bank and the African Development Bank, Glenn, to bring you back into this conversation, it seems to all be pointing to an innovative approach to funding Africa's infrastructure.
Correct, and I think that's probably been the success of the China story, really is about being pragmatic, and I think we'll see more of that pragmatic view on how to make things happen.
Kenneth, let's bring you in for a final comment. Your overall assessment of the China-Africa relationship, but more importantly, whether you think that this is a relationship that's poised for even further growth for Kenya, keeping in mind, of course, that we know that the growth of the Chinese economy is slowing.
Well, I would say two things in summary. That the relationship between China and Africa is a good relationship. It is a relationship that Africans should look to improve. What Africans should look to do is to improve the terms and conditions with which they get credit, with which they do trade, with which they do investment. However, I think African governments should educate our people or our citizens into understanding the true nature of whatever the relationship between Africa and China is, so that we get from this misinformation or this controversy that sometimes is not there, that African governments are merely protesting against Western, hegemony in political economy. So I think if African governments or Africans can work towards opening up the relationships where people know exactly what it is about, it is a good relationship that people should focus in. It does not matter whether credit or investment comes from China or from the West, but whether it is for the good of the African continent.
It is a good relationship as long as it's for the good of the continent. And that's the final word from Nairobi. A very big thank you to my guests tonight, and thank you for making the time to join us. Glenn Ho, partner at KPMG, with his insights, giving us a China-Africa overview as well as a South African insight. And of course, Kenneth Okwara, director at the Africa Center for People, Institutions and Society. They're giving us an East African perspective as well as a broader African perspective. A very big thank you to them. For you at home, remember that you can send us your comments. The details to do that are on your screen. From myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye.